the time being, we are going to move on. And our next speaker is Donovan Ginsberg. She is a professor at Duke University, works on Latin literature, early empire, kind of all sorts of things, honestly. whole big range of stuff that she does here, Civil War, and also she is a delight to follow on Twitter. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. Take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and make sure that I'm sharing the right one. There we go. Everyone see it? Okay, awesome. So thank you for having me today, and also especially to all of you who signed on. I know we have stiff competition today from TAPA, so hopefully this will be helpful. And as Amy said, I'm here to talk about teaching statements, which are sometimes also called teaching philosophy statements, or a statement of teaching excellence, or even the vague evidence of effective teaching, which is a term that I'm going to come back to at the very end, but in which the statement plays a big role. So we're going to talk through this by talking about, what do hiring committees look for when they ask for such a statement? What are the topics you want to hit to make sure you're meeting what they're looking for? And what are some rhetorical tips to show your best self? So with all of these materials, I think the teaching statement is best approached by thinking about, what is the hiring committee trying to use this document to figure out? How does it help them make a shortlist? So when hiring a colleague, and this is either a short-term or a long-term colleague, we're looking for someone who takes teaching seriously, first and foremost, if we've asked for such a statement. And that may seem obvious, but I think it's really important to keep in mind. Then we're hoping to find someone who can hit the ground running with our students. So mentoring for new teachers can be hit or miss. And we want to make sure that there's someone who has the basics already and can also learn on the job. And we also hope for someone who knows that you're actually never done becoming a better teacher. There is never a moment in which you are done with this. So we want someone who reflects often about what makes for effective teaching and is open to change, especially for student feedback. And finally, we want someone who wants to create engaged classrooms where students want to be learning semester after semester. And you might think, wow, that's a lot of vague stuff. And that's true, because there's no one size fits all way to do this, just as there's no right and only way to be an engaged teacher. And so that alone kind of makes a statement like this hard, because there aren't right answers or one size fits all templates. And I love Eleni's language of no 1, 2, 3 recipe. And that's equally true of the teaching statement. And I want to name that this can be really intimidating for grad students, especially if you have limited teaching experience. But these statements actually don't require you to have years and years behind you to do well. So we're going to focus on how to put your best foot forward with these. So I want to start by just saying a simple thing. The best teaching statements do one thing, and they do it really well, which is create a memorable picture of you inside the classroom interacting with students. And each of these points is important, so I put it up again, hopefully. I want to be able to imagine you on the job teaching real students, not fantasy students, and I want to remember what you say after I've read hundreds of these. So let's break down how you do that. First and foremost, I want you to take us inside your classroom. So use Enargeia, use Exempla to paint a picture of yourself teaching. This means include specific, memorably articulated examples. The smaller, the better in a lot of cases. Resist the urge to generalize your approaches into something that anyone could say. So ask yourself, what activities do I do? How do I structure class time? More specifically, show me that your classroom is engaged. How do you actively engage your students during class time? And I mean as real people, not imagined platonic students. I want you to show me a teacher who is reflective. How are you evaluating your own success? How do you adapt to various challenges in the classroom space that you've encountered? I also want you, and this can seem a little scary, again, to people early in their career, a teacher that has some breadth of experience. And this can include, say, language teaching, if that's applicable to you, as well as culture classes, a big class versus a small class, a general introduction class versus something that acquires a little bit more experience. But I want you to do this again through individual specific examples versus generic platitudes. And finally, this is probably the most important and the hardest, because it makes people feel a little awkward. Show off. What are you proud of? This can be something tiny. You could have come up with an excellent cartoon to teach a type of ablative. But if it teaches me something about you in the classroom that you're proud of, I really want to read it. And I'm going to be able to remember that pride through your words. And that's what's going to help your statement stand out for doing this. So what are the specific rules? There are some, not many. but the most important is 1 to 2 pages max. And I mean that. Don't you dare go on to a 3rd page. You can do everything you need to in 1 to 2 pages. There's no specific format, but you do have to pick a structure for short, focused paragraphs that are going to make up your statement. So some people do this by different types of classes: a paragraph on intro language teaching, a paragraph on major courses, a paragraph on introductory courses. Some people do this by different types of activities. So a paragraph on innovative uses of technology, a paragraph on approaches to teaching writing. Some people do this through different illustrations of core beliefs about teaching, and that's a concept I'm going to come back to. It doesn't matter. You just have to pick something and you have to go with it and be consistent, because that's going to give your statement a logical order. You also want to show some degree of breadth. As I said before, you're not a one-trick pony. You can teach more than one course that you've taught before. And you want to show this implicitly versus, say, just listing things, which your CV will already do anyway, your cover letter will already touch on. So instead, you're just showing through the examples that you choose, and we'll come back to how you choose those, that you can teach a number of different things. You want to use the personal voice. Again, that might seem obvious, but it's really important to feel like there's a human that's talking to you about teaching. You want to use active, vivid verbs. The professor is in has a great discussion of graduate students hedging with trying to, endeavor to, wish to. Those are lots of filler words that get in the way of showing you as an active person in the classroom. And then concomitant with that, be discipline specific, but not jargon filled. Remember, this is a teaching statement. You're trying to communicate something about how you communicate with students. If your statement is full of jargon that's going to fly over the head of all of my students, I'm going to have some questions about how you're actually going to communicate with those students in the classroom. So even more than I think many other of the types of job market documents you're doing, this is a writing sample that's communicating who you are when you talk to my students. And if I'm interested in that, if I've asked you for such a statement, I really want you to be as clear as possible. So starting strong matters. You want to hook the reader from the beginning. Remember, the tired person who's on their 3rd coffee who really wants to learn something exciting about your teaching. So the opening is the best place to hook this committee member. And after going through a lot of statements, there are kind of 3 basic openings for the vast majority of teaching statements. I don't mean this to be prescriptive. You might find an entirely different one, but these are the ones that I've seen a lot. And I also have my own sort of idiosyncratic subjective feelings about these, but I first want to introduce what they are. So people often start with quotations about teaching, or a quotation that leads them to be able to say something about teaching. Others like to start with a statement of your own belief about what good teaching is, or about how to create an engaged classroom. And then the rest of the statement follows, illustrating that with examples. And then a third unsung hero is the in medias res, which starts with an example from your classroom that you think is illustrative of something wider about your teaching, and then moves on to do that. So if you want to think about how to have a good hook, which I think is particularly important, you want to think about something in these categories. But they each have pitfalls. So quotations, for example, can often be extremely overused. I worked for the teaching center at my graduate institution, and I remember the woman there that was in charge of helping people with teaching portfolios came in once and banned this Plutarch quote. She was not a classicist. No one else in the program was a classicist, but it had been so overused in teaching statements that she'd seen that she would just throw your paper back at you if you used it. So that's what I mean, where things can become overused, and especially for scholars in a field that heavily relies on literature, we want to avoid cliches. Sometimes those can annoy people, but I think a good quote that's not overused, can actually do a lot of good work for you. A statement of belief about good teaching is also attractive because it feels neutral, authoritative, and not particularly embarrassing. But it can be great if you have a lot of teaching experience, but for less experienced instructors, it often is a place where you lean on platitudes. And I like to phrase that as empty statements that it could appear on a Starbucks mug about motivational teaching or an inspirational poster. You really don't want that. So if you want to go for a statement of belief about good teaching, you want to workshop that with a lot of people to make sure it's saying something specific to you, not just specific about sort of an imagined ideal teacher. And then the in medias res, when well done, can be extremely accessible to any experience level because it's using one tiny anecdote from one class in order to introduce something memorable about you as a teacher. But you want to make sure it's not just something that's funny. or silly, you want to make sure that the anecdote that you pick does implicitly say something bigger about your teaching. And I pulled 2 examples just in case people haven't seen this before that are adapted from people that I've worked with to show how this can work. So example 1, I was acting like an octopus when it happened, 10 weeks into my first semester teaching introductory Greek during a sight reading exercise, and I had resorted to pantomime, the language teacher's dubious best friend. The second, as I counted the votes, the verdict was unanimous. Orestes was guilty of matricide. After a series of persuasive speeches made by their peers, my student jurors had just overturned the deciding vote of Athena from Aeschylus' Eumenides. So both of these are memorable. I'm going to want to talk to the octopus person because that just seems funny. But they also lead into different methods of engaging students. So the first, you can see how the rest of that statement, or at least part of it, might talk about interlanguage pedagogy and how you engage students in the classroom in different ways. And the second might lead into a discussion of how you approach literature in various types of courses or cultures or other sorts of things. But both make me curious to want to talk to this person and to keep reading about what else they're going to tell me about this statement. So these are vivid, hooked openings that don't do the work of the statement, but do the work of making me want to keep reading. So in the time that remains, I want to get serious about tips for actually drafting this thing, which is subject to a lot of procrastination. First, I want you to think of the best class sessions you have ever been part of as either an instructor or a TA or discussion leader or something like that. And I want you to write them down, actually physically write them down on paper. And then I want you to ask yourself, what went well? Like, why do I consider those memorable, achievable things? Why do you remember them? What went into those successes? So what were the various factors? And then some of those factors are controllable, some of them are not controllable. What did you do that made them effective? So it can't just be that the students were magic that day. They may have been magic that day, but how did you contribute to that magic in a way that you can encapsulate? What did you do that made them effective? And then what evidence or examples can you bring to illustrate the success for someone who wasn't there? Like, how do you make sense to someone who is not going to sit down and think about your whole class, who's going to get a couple of sentences and wants to see you there? And I actually want you to write down those answers too. So I'm a big believer in the power of writing things out by hand. And then I want you to look at your list for a couple of things. The ability to describe that example memorably and vividly for someone who was not there. I want you to have cumulative breadth among 3 to 4 examples that you're picking. So that breadth, as we described, different types of courses, different approaches, those sorts of things. And then once you've picked your examples, I want you to look for, are there overarching threads that connect your approach? Are there things the examples have in common that you can extrapolate backwards into something about what you think makes good teaching? And this is a helpful way, especially again, for those that don't have as much teaching experience, to be able to start to think about what is my teaching philosophy that I actually genuinely believe in. After you do that, you can explore all sorts of various structures to see which feels best. Again, I don't actually think the structure matters as long as you pick something that's consistent, because it's a rhetorical document. So my biggest advice is actually this. Statements like this are really awkward to start. It can feel like bragging, which we're really uncomfortable doing. It can bring out imposter syndrome, and that's something terrible that doesn't make you want to write. So my advice is draft early. In fact, for those on the market right now at this workshop, which I assume is all of you, go and make this list today. And if it's too awkward to write it out, go find a friend for a Zoom or a coffee and talk through some examples that you want to use. Don't wait and just dive in. And once you've drafted this, the first draft will probably not be great, and that's fine. Share it widely. Share it with people at all sorts of levels who can help show your best self, and then revise, revise, revise. But this statement benefits not at all from procrastinating writing it. It benefits more from incremental approaches to try to make sure that you're showing your best self there. So to sum up, I think the best statements create a memorable picture of you inside the classroom, actually teaching, not just talking about it, actively interacting with your students. And that's your goal. And I think that the vivid, well-chosen examples are the best ways to achieve it. But I think I have about 30 seconds. And so I wanted to add a coda here about a question I often get, which, what is this phrase, evidence of effective teaching, that people have? It means a lot of things, and committees are often desperately unclear when they include this language. Sometimes it's HR language. It always means this teaching statement. It always means some aspect of teaching evaluations, and we can talk about that, whether it's a summary or all of them. But it also can include many things that get back to, what are you proud of? Do you have a sample syllabus that's great? Do you have an assignment that's cool? Do you have a course description you want to work up? Do you have other stuff, no matter how small it is? Maybe you have a great writing rubric, something that can go in there that shows this principle of the engaged teacher. So it's another thing where there's not a one size fits all, but the teaching statement is always the core of what a committee means when they say evidence of effective teaching. So I will stop there and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. Wonderful